let's spend a few moments looking at some basic alignment issues that often trip people up in my classes. So I want to go over pelvic floor, zipping up the core, neutral spine, and then hinging from the hips today. So let's start seated. You could do this first part in a chair or come on down to the floor, but I do want you sitting on something, whether it's some blankets like I am or a couple of yoga blocks, but I want to be seated so that the hips are higher than the knees. And we start by getting the flesh of the bum out from behind. Okay, so let's find the pelvic floor. The best way to find that is to rock side to side on your sit bones. So the sit bones are those little nubs at the base of the pelvis, and you want to rock back and forth to feel each one of them pressing into the blanket, and then find that sweet spot in the middle where you are equal. So that means you're not sitting on one hip or the other. Okay, so once you've got those sit bones equal, let's tilt the pelvis forward and back. So we just roll all the way forward till we can find the pubic bone, and roll all the way back until you feel the tailbone. And go back and forth a few times so you get the feeling of what it's like to be exaggerated one way or the other. And then again, try to find what we call that sweet spot where you're perfectly balanced in between the pubic bone and the tailbone. You're still equally weighted on each sit bone, but your pelvis is in the position so that you're actually seated slightly forward of those sit bones versus having the sit bones pressing straight down. So in this position, the flesh that you feel in between the sit bones, in between the pubic bone and the tailbone, that's your pelvic floor. So let it relax. Feel that area pressing in or sinking into the blankets. And then engage that area. Lift the area. I might say lift it, engage it, or activate it. It's all the same thing. What I want you to do is pull those muscles up towards the crown of the head. The easiest way to start to learn this is to imagine that you need to go to the bathroom, but there isn't a bathroom nearby. So you simply have to lift and engage those pelvic floor muscles. Okay. That's where the pelvic floor is. And if we are seated properly on that pelvic floor, it already starts to engage the core muscles and it sets the body up for being in good alignment. So from here, we'll move on to a neutral spine. So we'll find this seated position where we're balanced nicely on the pelvic floor. We've got that pelvic floor lifted. So now we want to find the neutral spine. And I like to use a dowel rod, or you could use a broom handle, a mop handle, anything that you like that's straight to help find that neutral spine. So we hold the dowel rod behind the body. We want to feel it lightly pressing into the sacrum, into the thoracic spine, and then into the back of the head. But there should be a nice little gap for the low back, and of course a nice gap for your neck. So when we are seated in neutral spine, this is how it looks. When we move from neutral spine, if we hinge from the hip creases, which I'll show you in a moment, we maintain that neutral spine, protecting and supporting the back. So that's neutral spine seated. Let's try neutral spine laying down. So we'll come off whatever support we're sitting on, and we'll lay back onto the back. So you want to lay down, let your knees be bent for this little teaching tool. And in order to know that you have the right amount of spinal curvature, let's slide that dowel rod underneath the low back. Kind of get it all the way to the other side. There we go. And then position your body as such that you feel the dowel rod just lightly touching your skin, but it's not painful by any means. Okay, and then for your head, if you notice that, like if your chin is tilted up towards the ceiling, then you may just need to readjust your head so that it's nose towards the ceiling, Or you may need to put a folded blanket underneath your head as well. So this will achieve a neutral spine here. So we move from a neutral spine to zipping up the core. And to zip up the core, we're going to utilize both the lifting the pelvic floor and the neutral spine, and then go into the zipping up of the core. So we want to lift the pelvic floor. Okay, now we're laying down. So you're not going to feel it when it's relaxed, pressing into the blanket or not, but you just imagine you're just lifting the pelvic floor towards the crown of the head. And then let's engage the transverse abdominal muscle. That's that corset muscle that goes across the low belly. Okay, so in order to engage that, imagine that you could pull your hips towards each other, towards the center of your low belly, and that you could press your sacrum lightly into the floor. That's engaging the transverse abdominal muscle. That's the most important muscle to be engaged here. So we have the pelvic floor lifted, the transverse abdominal muscle engaged. So now we're going to be very supportive of the spine and keep it in neutral as we start to hug the vertebrae. So imagine starting from the sacrum, working up through the low back, even the mid back and the upper back, like you're just hugging the muscles that support the vertebrae. These are those multifidus muscles, the ones that are the deep, deep spinal stabilizers. So we zip that up. That's where I get the visual of zipping up from the pelvic floor, through the pelvis, through the sacrum, all the way up the spine. Now we've got our body secured in that neutral spine. We've got the abdominals and the back muscles are all protected and are ready to be strengthened. So from here, if we were to stretch one or both legs out straight, keeping the core zipped up, then we would be able to do that and maintain a neutral spine, neither arching the back excessively, which would cause a backache, or flattening the back to the floor. We keep it neutral. See, I can still move that dowel rod, but I still feel it, and I feel it equally on the muscles on either side of my vertebrae. So I know I'm in balance on the back. While we have the core zipped up, then we could also move into some abdominal strengtheners and back strengtheners and know that the back is protected. So if we started to do leg lifts or toe dips, we could do that, and the spine wouldn't have to be, we wouldn't be pressing the low back into the floor, but we wouldn't be arching the low back, and hopefully we wouldn't be feeling any back pain because we're stabilized. So we could do all those motions while keeping the spine in neutral. So that's why we want to keep the neutral spine, is to protect the back and to enhance full body alignment. So let's go on maybe up to standing and do just a little more with alignment, and then we'll move into the hip hinge. Okay, let's find neutral spine while standing. So if you have your handy dandy dowel rod, just bring it behind. Find those connecting spots, the back of the head, the thoracic spine, and the sacrum. And you can bend and straighten your legs a few times and just see if you can go up and down while keeping that spine neutral. Now, what will help to keep it in neutral is if you zip up the core before you do anything. So let's do that. We're going to zip up the core by lifting the pelvic floor, hugging the hip points towards each other, and then pressing them towards the sacrum. Now, you can't press your sacrum into the floor. That idea of sort of scrunching it all together, and then hug all the little muscles along the vertebrae as they move from the low back to the mid back into the upper back, while allowing your shoulders themselves to stay soft. Now just bend and straighten the legs a few times. Feel how solid that feels. And then let's put a soft bend in the knees and hinge from the hips so that we're folding forward. Okay, so my spine is staying in neutral even as I come down into this deep forward fold. And we can come back upright using the strength of the core, protects the back, strengthens the core, and keeps the body in a nice, safe, supported alignment. So that is neutral spine while standing. Now, I mentioned hinging from the hips there. And that's the next thing I want to talk about, because we often are confused about where our hips are. So if you put your hands on your hips, you're going to probably be putting them on the top of your pelvis, even though you think that's your hips. The little bony part that stands out is the top of the iliac crest, the top of your pelvis. Your hips are actually a few inches lower than that. So when we're hinging from the hips, we want to hinge from this area where the leg meets the pelvis. You can find that by just bending your leg and lifting. Okay, so you find this crease, and this is your hip crease, and that's what we want to hinge from. So if you put a finger where your hip crease is, and then straighten that leg back out, and then use your other hand to find your hip point, or where you might think of as being your hips, you'll notice there's a fairly good gap there, a good 3 inches or more. So when people think that they're hinging from the hips, a lot of times they're just bending from the waist. And that kind of flattens out the low back, and it's not the best for alignment, it's not the healthiest for the back itself. But if you think of hinging from your hip crease, then you could softly bend the knees, stick the bum out just a little, and hinge forward. That's where you get that neutral spine that I just showed you, and it comes naturally that way. Same principle when we're in a lunge or a back bend. So if we are taking a lunge, oftentimes, so if we're in a lunge with that right foot forward, I'll say press your left hip crease forward, and that's so we can stretch out the front of the thigh. And what I see often is pressing from that hip point and just kind of arching the back as we lean forward, and that's not beneficial. It's not supportive at all. So what we'll do after zipping up the core is, okay, find your hip crease. So that's going to be a few inches lower than the hip point. If you press that area forward, then the whole pelvis is moving as one unit, is what it's causing. The glutes will engage, the hamstrings will engage, and that is what allows the hip flexor and the quadricep to lengthen and soften, and that's what we're looking for here. So when we press the hip crease forward, we're stretching out the front of the hip, stabilizing the low back so that we're protecting that area. And then lastly, if we're doing some kind of a back bend, same thing. So often we'll be either kneeling or standing, and we'll maybe put the hands in the back pockets, and then I'll say press the hips forward, the hip creases forward, and what I'll see is this overarching of the low back, and it's again, it's not the best alignment, and it's not very supportive of a back. So what we think of as pressing the hips forward, I want you to remember that your hips are lower than you think, and it's the hip creases. So if we press the fists into the back pockets, we engage the glutes, we press the hip creases forward, that feels much more stable. I'm protecting the low back, and then from there, then I can lift the chest and maybe lift the gaze upward. Okay, so the back bend, it's a little more subtle of a back bend, but it's much, much healthier, much safer, much more supportive. And coming out of it, we just keep that core zipped up as we return upright. So that is pelvic floor, neutral spine, zipping up the core, and hinging from the hips. Those are the most common issues that the folks in my class have and that struggle with. So take a look at yourself, do these little movements with near a mirror, see what you can find, discover any imbalances that you might have, and hopefully you find this helpful in improving your posture and alignment and your experience in all of your stretching or strengthening classes.